The Supreme Command planned to destroy the enemy's main forces in the following manner. As soon as the final concentration of the enemy's main groupings in the assault positions was established, powerful fire was to be opened on him suddenly with all types of guns and mortars, and our aviation was simultaneously to strike at him with all the means at its disposal. It was resolved to continue the aerial onslaught throughout the defensive fighting, using the aircraft from the neighbouring fronts for this purpose, and also the Supreme Command's long-range aviation. When the enemy went over to the offensive, the forces on the Voronezh and central fronts were to doggedly defend every position, every line, with fire, counterattacks and counterblows from the depth. The moving up of reserves incorporating tank corps and armies from operational depth to the threatened sectors was envisaged for this purpose. Once the enemy had been weakened and brought to a halt, the forces on the Voronezh, Central, Steppe and Bryansk fronts, and the left flank of the Western Front and the right flank of the Southwestern Front were to go over to a counter-offensive immediately. In accordance with the decision taken, the Supreme Command issued a directive setting the following assignments. The Central Front was charged with defending the northern part of the Kursk salient, in order to exhaust and drain the enemy of his strength in the course of defensive operations. After this, it was to launch a counter-offensive and, in coordination with the Bryansk and Western fronts, smash the German grouping in the Orel area. The Voronezh front, which was charged with defending the southern part of the Kursk salient, was also to wear down the enemy and bleed him white, and then to go over to a counter-offensive in coordination with the Steppe front and the right flank of the southwestern front, and rout the enemy completely in the Kharkov and Belgorod areas. The main forces on the Voronezh front were to concentrate on the left flank, on the section where the 6th and 7th Guards armies were deployed. The Steppe front, which was located beyond the Central and Voronezh fronts, on a line stretching from Izmalkovo, Livny, the river Kushen to Bely Kolodez, was charged with preparing the defences along the above-mentioned line, and countering possible breakthroughs by the enemy from the Central and Voronezh fronts, and was also to be prepared to start offensive operations. The troops on the Bryansk front and the left flank of the Western Front were to help the Central Front in frustrating the enemy offensive, and also to be ready to mount an offensive on the Oral sector. The central staff of the partisan movement was set the task of organising sabotage on a large scale in the enemy rear to wreck all the enemy's vital lines of communication in the Orel, Kharkov and other regions, and also to collect and dispatch to the Stavka all the important intelligence information regarding the enemy. Independent offensive operations were envisaged on a number of sectors in the country's south and on the northwestern direction to pin down the enemy's forces and prevent him from manoeuvring with his reserves. In all, the Supreme Command and the General Staff settled on the following. On the basis of the situation taking shape, the enemy could be expected to go over to the offensive during the second half of May. All fronts must be on full alert. In the case of the enemy commencing the offensive, there should be a series of counter-preparations, and the necessary measures must be taken to provide depth-echeloned defensive formations. This was essential to maintaining the utmost degree of combat readiness and vigilance in all the armies. All operations must be carried out within the framework of a comprehensive battle plan. Use should be made of all weapons of combat and equipment to have artillery, tanks and aircraft in large quantities on hand. A second-order directive must be given to facilitate a concerted effort in the context of a sustained operation against the enemy. The top political and military leadership were aware that the German command had now amassed and concentrated powerful forces in the salient of Kursk. There were doubts about the effectiveness of our own operations against the German forces. The leaders understood that the Germans could not be allowed to succeed in such a powerful offensive. Otherwise, the situation on the Soviet-German front would have changed entirely. In late May, the enemy's main blow was expected to come in June or July. The situation was getting more tense as the Nazis prepared their forces for the attack. The Germans were obsessed with the idea of destroying the Red Army and so returning to the east. Meanwhile, the Red Army and its partners had gathered the forces necessary to withstand any possible attack. A meeting of the commanders of the fronts with the General Staff was convened. At the meeting, we determined the priorities for the upcoming battle. It was decided that our strategy was to defend our positions while preparing for a counteroffensive. With every passing day, the expectation of an imminent offensive by the enemy loomed large. Right behind the 6th Army, in the second echelon on the Oboyan sector, the 1st Tank Army was stationed, commanded by General Katukov. The 69th Army was disposed beyond the junction between the 6th and 7th Armies, covering the sector on Korocha and Prokhorovka. The front reserves, the 35th Guards Rifle Corps and the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, were deployed in the Korocha area, and the 5th Guards Tank Corps to the south of Oboyan. The 1st Tank Army prepared a line of defences and other dug-in fortifications for all units, so that the enemy troops could be countered from stationary positions with tank and all other types of artillery fire should it prove necessary. Thanks to the efforts of the troops, a carefully coordinated fire system had been worked out with the neighbouring troops, both along the front line and in depth, as well as air-ground cooperation. The most dangerous sector of the Central Front, near Poneri, was defended by the 13th Army under the command of General Pukov. Beyond the junction between this army and General Galanin's 70th Army, the 2nd Tank Army under the command of General Rodin was disposed in operational depth. The 9th and 19th Tank Corps and several anti-tank artillery units comprised the reserves at the front. General S.I. Rudenko's 16th Army was providing the air cover. I would just like to say a few words about our reserves. When making preparations for the Kursk operation, the Supreme Command put great effort into ensuring that they had large reserves at their disposal. The troops of the steppe front were concentrated on the Livny-Stary-Oskol line, and it was their job to counter any surprise attacks and to act as a strong front grouping in the overall counteroffensive. The steppe front was comprised of General A.S. Zhadov's 5th Guards Field Army, the 27th, 53rd, and 47th Field Armies, the 5th Guards Tank Army, the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps, the 4th Guards Tank Corps, the 10th Tank Corps, and the 3rd, 5th, and 7th Cavalry Corps. The steppe front was supported by the 5th Air Army. The commander of the front was Colonel General Konev, the member of the Military Council was Lieutenant General Suzaikov, and the chief of the front staff was Lieutenant General Zakharov. The steppe front was allotted a major part in the operation. It was to stop the advancing enemy from making deep thrusts into our lines, and during the counter-offensive, its task was to intensify the impact of the blow by striking out with our forces from depth. As the forces on that front were deployed at a considerable distance from the enemy, they were ensured freedom of manoeuvring. The steppe front fundamentally differed in its composition and purpose from the reserve front, which had been in operation on the approaches to Moscow in the autumn of 1941. At that time, the reserve front was essentially a second operational echelon deployed by the main forces on the rear lines of the Western Front. The situation finally became clear in the last few days of June, and we realized that the enemy would mount an offensive in the coming days, precisely here in the Kursk area and nowhere else. Stalin telephoned me on June 30th. He ordered me to remain on the Orel sector to coordinate the operations of the Central, Bryansk and Western fronts. "Vasilevsky is in command on the Voronezh front," said the Supreme Commander. At the time, I was on the Central Front, where Rokossovsky and I were working with the troops of the 13th Army, the 2nd Tank Army, and the Reserve Corps. In the section covered by the 13th Army, where the enemy was expected to spearhead his main thrust, provision was made for exceptionally dense artillery fire. The 4th Artillery Corps of the Supreme Command Reserve, which was provided with 700 guns and mortars, was disposed near Poneri. All the main forces of the front's artillery units were deployed here, as well as the Supreme Command Reserve. The density of the artillery was brought up to 92 guns and mortars per kilometre of the front line. To repel a large-scale tank thrust, anti-tank defences on both fronts were constructed in full troop deployment depth and supplied with artillery, tanks and artificial obstacles and mines. The strongest anti-tank defences on the Central Front were made ready in the 13th Army's zone and the flanks of the 48th and 70th Armies adjacent to it. The anti-tank artillery defences in the 13th Army Zone of the Central Front comprised more than 30 pieces per kilometre of the front line. On the Voronezh front, it comprised 15.6 guns per kilometre of the front line in the zones of the 6th and 7th Guards armies, and as many as 30 pieces if we take into account the means at the disposal of the second echelon. The anti-tank defences on this section were, moreover, reinforced by 2 tank regiments and 1 tank brigade. The defences consisted of anti-tank strongpoints and tank-proof localities on all sectors where tank attacks were likely to be made. Besides the employment of artillery and tanks, the sections were extensively mined, anti-tank ditches were dug, and scarps and other artificial obstacles were created. Mobile obstacle detachments and anti-tank reserves were extensively used as well. All these anti-tank measures were sufficiently effective, for we had gleaned tremendous experience in the previous hard fighting. The enemy tank troops were sure to be defeated, and this would help to promote the complete rout of the invaders. The following was established from documents captured and from intelligence information. Aviation comprised of the 1st, 4th and 8th Air Corps with a total number of more than 2,000 combat planes under the command of General Field Marshal Richthofen, was in the field against the Central and Voronezh fronts. Since March, the enemy air forces had gradually been stepping up their raids on railway junctions, roads, towns and key targets in the rear, and in June they started bombing our fighting forces and rear zones increasingly more often. Cover for the troops and the whole of the Kursk salient was provided by the 2nd, 5th and 16th Air Armies and 2 fighter divisions of the country's anti-aircraft defence. As an enemy offensive was expected, the fronts were considerably reinforced with anti-aircraft resources, which allowed them to cover a large number of objects with 2, 3, 4 and 5-layer barrage. The anti-aircraft artillery defences operated in coordination with fighter aircraft and the whole of the observation, warning and guidance service. The carefully and well-organised anti-aircraft defence on the fronts and the whole of the Kursk salient provided reliable cover for our troops and caused the enemy air forces to sustain heavy losses. The depth of fortifications along the fronts was more than 150 kilometres, and counting the steppe front, the overall depth was 250, 300 kilometres. Very much was done to provide the troops with ample engineering facilities and effective means of destroying the advancing enemy. A truly enormous amount of work was done by the logistical service of the fronts, armies and formations. Unfortunately, little has been written here about the rear services and its officers, who, through their diligence and initiative, greatly helped the troops and commanding officers of all levels to combat the enemy, crush him, and put an end to the war with a worldwide historic victory. In general, a battle cannot be won today without an efficient, accurately functioning logistical service. Lack of the appropriate materiel and supplies during an operation cannot help but result in setbacks. Without logistical facilities thoroughly organised on the basis of precise mathematical calculations, without sufficient supplies of everything required for operations, without very accurate estimation of the volume of logistical transportation, without proper evacuation arrangements, any proper and rational conducting of any large combat operation is out of the question, M.V. Frunze said. On the Central Front, the chief of logistics was General N.A. Antipenko. At the time of the battle for Moscow, he had been chief of logistics of the 49th Army on the Western Front. Even at that time, he displayed outstanding organizational abilities. Excellent work was also done by the chief of the logistics of the First Ukrainian Front, General N.P. Anisimov, who was of great assistance in providing the troops fighting in difficult conditions with materiel. Anisimov commanded well-deserved respect among the troops and in the logistical service. I especially recall the Proskurovo-Chernovtsi operation, when he coped splendidly with organizing the front's logistical facilities, in spite of the completely impassable roads in spring. A really concerted effort was needed to provide materiel for the forthcoming operations, so that the actions planned by the Supreme Command on the fronts could be made possible. On the Central and Voronezh fronts alone, 1,336,000 men, 3,444 tanks and self-propelled pieces of artillery, 19,100,000 guns and mortars, and 2,900 aircraft, taking into account the long-range aircraft and the Southwestern Front's 17th Air Army, are known to have been involved in the fighting. In spite of the bad weather, the great difficulties in transportation, and the enemy's attempts to frustrate deliveries of all that was needed for the imminent operations through air raids, there were 57,056 rail cars with supplies that were sent to the units before the offensive. It is common knowledge that the active participation of all branches of the armed forces, including the troops of the military administration and the rear services, was needed to ensure the successful actions of our armed forces. Those actions had a decisive influence on the combat activities in the operations of the Central and Voronezh fronts and in the battle at Kursk in general. Once he had regrouped his shock tank units, on the morning of July 7th, the enemy mounted a fierce attack on Ponieri. The defence line there was held by the 307th Rifle Division, commanded by Major General Yenshin, reinforced with the 5th Artillery Division, the 13th Anti-Tank Artillery Brigade, and the 11th and 22nd Mortar Brigades. The din of fierce fighting on the ground and in the air continued unabated all day long around Ponieri. The enemy hurled more and more tank units into battle, but he did not manage to break through the defences here either. On July 8th, the attacks were stepped up on the Olkovatka sector. Here, once again, the enemy came up against the heroic staunchness of the Soviet men. The artillerymen of the 3rd Anti-Tank Artillery Brigade, commanded by Colonel Rukosuyev, particularly distinguished themselves. Greatly outnumbered, the brigade fought an unequal battle against 300 enemy tanks, nor did the enemy have any success in subsequent attempts to break through the Soviet forces' defences. Thus, having lost a considerable part of their tanks, on which Hitler had mainly staked, the German troops were not able to advance before July 10th. During the above battle, Stalin rang me in the small hours of July 9th at the command post of the Central Front, and once he had learned of the situation, he said, "Don't you think it's time to move the Bryansk front and the left flank of the Western Front into action, as was envisaged in the plan? Here, on the sector of the Central Front, the enemy no longer has at his disposal forces capable of breaking through our forces' defences," I replied. "We must attack immediately with all the forces on the Bryansk front and the left flank of the Western Front, without which the Central Front can't carry out the planned counteroffensive successfully before the enemy gets a respite to organise his defences, which is something he will be forced to do." "All right, go and see Popov and get the Bryansk front into action. When will the Bryansk front be able to begin the offensive?" "On the 12th? "That's settled then." I did not trouble to ask the Supreme Commander about the state of affairs on the sectors of the Voronezh front, since I was directly in contact with Vasilevsky and with the General Staff, and knew that there had been extremely fierce fighting there, just as on the other sectors of the Central Front. Allow me to give a brief account of the events on the first day of the battle on the section of the Voronezh front, of which I had learned from a report to the Stavka from the front command. At 16:10 on July 4th, the enemy's advanced detachments began offensive operations. The aim of these operations was apparently reconnaissance. On July 5th, following artillery and air bombardment, the enemy launched an offensive from the Streletsky-Tomarovka-Zibino-Trefilovka area, with no less than 450 tanks. The first attack was repulsed. In the afternoon, after moving heavy Tiger tanks into action, the enemy again went into the attack. This time he succeeded in crushing the resistance offered by the 52nd Guards Rifle Division, which was commanded by Colonel E.M. Nekrasov, and in taking a number of villages, among them Berezov, Gremuchi, Bikovo, Kozma-Demyanovka, and Voznesensky. Hard pressed, the neighbouring 67th Guards Rifle Division, under the command of Colonel A.I. Baksov, abandoned Cherkaskoye and withdrew to Krasny Pochinok. On that day, the Nazi troops sustained tremendous losses, but the front's troops also lost 60 tanks, 78 aircraft, and a considerable number of men. From an analysis of the enemy offensive, it became obvious that more enterprising and experienced generals were directing his troops in the Belgorod area. This was indeed the case. General Field Marshal Manstein had taken over command of the grouping. But what was happening on the Bryansk front? On the evening of July 9th, as instructed by the Supreme Commander, I was at the front headquarters, where I met Commander M.M. Popov, member of the Military Council L.Z. Meklis, and Chief of Staff of the Front, L.M. Sandalov. They had already received orders from the Stavka to go over to the offensive. I should mention how exceptionally well versed in tactics General Sandalov, Chief of Staff, was, his ability to plan offensive operations precisely and to organize a system of troop control. I had been acquainted with him since the battle for Moscow, when he had been the 20th Army's Chief of Staff. He was one of the most capable of our Chiefs of Staff, with a real understanding of strategy and tactics. The offensive had been planned and the armies were well prepared. Exceptionally talented and experienced generals were in command of the armies. The Third Army was commanded by General A.V. Gorbatov, the 61st Army by General P.A. Belov, the 63rd Army by General V. Yar Kolpachi, the 3rd Guards Tank Army by General P.S. Rybalko, and the 11th Guards Army of the Western Front, which was to attack at the same time as the Bryansk Front, was under the command of General I. Keicha Bagramyan. I visited all these armies of the Bryansk and Western Fronts and gave their commanding officers help and advice as best I could. I particularly had to go into detail in the army under Bagramyan, with whom I had long had working and comradely contacts. At that time, the commander of the Western Front, General V.D. Sokolovsky, and the representative of the Stavka, General N.N. Voronov, who was supervising artillery matters, were with Bagramyan. When discussing the method of artillery fire reported by Artillery Commander of the 11th Guards Army, General P.S. Semyonov, the idea was conceived of confronting the enemy with some kind of new method, unknown to him. After lengthy talks, we all decided not to begin our attack after artillery preparation, as was customary, as this helped the enemy to tell when our troops would launch an attack, but in the course of artillery preparation itself at the moment when its rate and volume was being stepped up. This method proved to be well worthwhile. On July 12th, the Bryansk Front and the reinforced 11th Guards Army of the Western Front went over to the offensive, and in spite of the well-ramified defences disposed in depth and the enemy's dogged resistance, broke through them and started to move forward in the general direction of Orel. As was expected, the enemy yielded on the Orel bridgehead and began to take his troops from the grouping operating against the Central Front and to send them into action against the Bryansk Front and the 11th Guards Army on the Western Front. The Central Front immediately took advantage of this and went over to a counterattack on July 15th. So, here in the Orel area, the general offensive the Nazis had prepared for so long ultimately ended in failure. The German troops now had to experience the bitterness of crippling defeat and to feel the power of Soviet arms, which rained down upon them, the much-hated enemy, with all their might. In the Belgorod area, however, the enemy was still dealing very powerful blows. On July 6th, extremely bloody fighting broke out on the Oboyan sector. On both sides, many hundreds of aircraft, tanks, and self-propelled guns were involved in the action simultaneously, but the enemy could not overthrow the formidable defences put up by our troops. The tank crews, artillerymen, and the units that had withdrawn from the front line courageously repelled the enemy's repeated attacks. On July 6th alone, the enemy lost more than 200 tanks here, tens of thousands of men, and approximately 100 combat aircraft. After moving up reserves and regrouping his forces, at dawn on July 7th, the enemy sent another strong grouping of tanks into action. The bulk of them attacked the 6th Guards Army and the 1st Tank Army on the Oboyan-Prokhorovka sector, and more than 200 tanks were sent against the 7th Guards Army, commanded by Shumilov on the Korocha sector. On the night of July 7th, our 6th Guards Army and 1st Tank Army received urgent reinforcements from front reserves. Fierce enemy attacks began again on the morning of July 7th. The incessant roar of the battle, the gritting noise of the tanks, and the raving of engines resounded unabated in the air and on the ground. The troops on the Voronezh front, which had fought with powerful air cover, did not allow the enemy to break through the second defence zone, but in some places he did manage to drive in a wedge. At that time, the Front Command sent the 2nd and 5th Guards Tank Corps, and also several rifle divisions and artillery units moved up from other directions into this sector, which had now become dangerous. In 2 days, the enemy lost at least another 200 tanks and a great deal of other materiel. His infantry units were already half their original size. Having regrouped his main forces in a narrower sector throughout July 10th, the enemy hurled them into the attack once again on the Prokhorovka sector, but again to no avail. Now there remained little more than a week to prepare for the decisive counteroffensive planned for the Voronezh front on July 12th. Moreover, the 1st Tank Army, with its well-organized defense line, was disposed in operational depth behind the 6th Guards Army's defenses, while the 69th Army was holding another prepared defense line beyond the junction between the 6th and 7th Guards Armies in depth. In the operational zone behind the 6th and 7th Guards Armies, there were the front reserves, the 35th Guards Rifle Corps, and the 2nd and 5th Guards Tank Corps. Hence, the criticism of the command of the Voronezh front is founded on a lack of knowledge of affairs there, on an inaccurate estimation of the forces, means, and specific conditions of the operational situation. Only the density of the strength and means of the armies has been calculated, disregarding the artillery from the Supreme Command Reserves, which was disposed in the zone of the 6th Guards Army. As far as the density of the tanks is concerned, the Front Command staked chiefly on the 1st Tank Army and on the 2nd and 5th Guards Tank Corps. To determine the strength of the defences in big battles, not only must the means and strength of tactical defence be taken into account, but also the forces in operational depth. Then no mistake will be made. As for the results of the defensive fighting on the fronts, it should not be forgotten that on the first day the enemy dealt his blow at the 6th and 7th Guards Armies on the Voronezh front with almost 5 corps, the 2nd SS Tank Corps, the 3rd Tank Corps, the 48th Tank Corps, the 52nd Army Corps, and part of the Raus Corps, while he attacked the central front with only 3 corps. The difference in the impact of the blows dealt by the German forces from the Orel direction and from the Belgorod area can easily be understood. As for Vatutin's ability to deal with strategic and operational questions, I must state with complete impartiality that Vatutin, the commander of the Voronezh front, was a highly erudite and steadfast commander. As I have already mentioned, the counter-offensive in the Kursk Bulge area had been prepared long before the enemy went over to the offensive. Back in May, the Supreme Command had considered a plan for a counter-offensive on the Orel sector codenamed Kutuzov. Its purpose was for the forces of the Central and Bryansk fronts and the left flank of the Western Front to deal a blow at the Orel grouping on 3 sides along the converging directions. It has already been noted that the troops on the Bryansk and Western fronts started to mount an offensive on July 12th, and those of the Central Front on July 15th. Thus, a mighty offensive was launched on 3 fronts in the Orel area, the immediate object of which was to defeat the enemy's Orel grouping. The counter-offensive started here, and also the great exhaustion of the enemy troops in the Belgorod area forced the Nazi command to acknowledge that the widely thought-out planned citadel had ended in failure. To prevent their forces from being completely destroyed, the enemy command decided to withdraw General Field Marshal Manstein's troops back to the lines of defences where the offensive had been started. The enemy succeeded in doing this, owing to the extreme exhaustion of our 1st Tank and 6th and 7th Guards armies. By July 23rd, the enemy's main forces had been pulled back to the Belgorod line of defences. Having reached the front line of the German defences by July 23rd, the troops of the Voronezh and Steppe fronts were not able to mount a counter-offensive immediately, although the Supreme Commander required it of them. They needed fresh supplies of fuel, ammunition, and other kinds of materiel to organize the coordination of all types of troops, careful reconnaissance, and to effect some regrouping of the troops, especially of artillery and tanks. At least 8 days were needed for this, according to the most rigid calculations. After repeated talks, the Supreme Commander reluctantly approved our decision, since this was the only way. The operation was planned in great depth and required careful preparation and all-around provisioning. Otherwise, it might end in failure for us. A well-calculated and prepared offensive should guarantee a definite breakthrough of the enemy's defences in tactical and operational depth, and such an assault should also provide the right conditions for subsequent offensive operations. However, the Supreme Commander was pressing us to start the operation. It took Vasilevsky and myself a great deal of trouble to persuade him that the action should not be launched in a hurry, and that the operation should only be mounted when everything was completely ready and all the materiel was at hand. The Supreme Commander concurred with us. After Stalin's death, the idea became current that he alone took decisions on questions of a military and strategic nature. I cannot agree with this. I have already mentioned above that when someone who had a good knowledge of the matter made a report to him, he would take notice of it. I even know of cases when he changed his mind with respect to decisions previously taken. This was the case in particular with the schedule of many operations. The battle fought in the Kursk, Orel and Belgorod area was one of the most important engagements of the Great Patriotic War and the Second World War as a whole. Not only were the picked and most powerful groupings of the Germans destroyed here, but the faith of the German army and the German people in the Nazi leadership and Germany's ability to withstand the growing might of the Soviet Union was irrevocably shattered. The defeat of the main grouping of German troops in the Kursk area paved the way for the subsequent wide-scale offensive operations by the Soviet forces to expel the Germans from our soil completely, and then from the territories of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania and Bulgaria, ultimately to crush Nazi Germany. What was the decisive factor in the enemy's defeat near Kursk? What caused his powerful, long-prepared offensive to fall through? Above all, when the defensive engagement was started, the Soviet troops were superior to their enemy, both in numbers and especially in quality. The increased might of the Soviet Air Force, the armoured forces and artillery allowed shock groupings to be formed in a short space of time that hastily smashed the resistance offered by the enemy forces. This also provided the Soviet military leadership with the opportunity to prepare for and confidently bring about the defeat of the enemy troops in the Kursk Bulge area and foil Hitler's far-reaching plan for offensive operations in 1943. Why did the enemy decide to mount his general offensive in the Kursk area? The point is that the operational disposition of the Soviet troops in the Kursk salient, which curved inwards towards the enemy, appeared extremely promising to the Nazi command. Here, two key fronts could be surrounded immediately, as a result of which a considerable breach would be made, allowing the enemy to conduct major operations in the southern and northeastern directions. In their appraisals of the situation and of possible enemy decisions, the Stavka, the General Staff, and the command of the front proceeded precisely from this assumption, which turned out to be correct. Remarkably, the entire Soviet Strategic Command was, in the main, unanimous in its appraisal of the impending enemy action. The improved skill of our staffs and commands on an operational and strategic scale was evident more than ever before in this unity of views founded on an in-depth analysis of all the conditions involved. This could certainly not be said of the German Forces Command, which had failed to appraise the situation correctly and thoroughly, and did not concur in their plans for the imminent operations and ways of conducting them. As it had lost the strategic initiative, it could not cope with the difficulties that arose, and things were made even more complicated by the sharp lowering of fighting spirit among the troops. As I have already mentioned in the battle near Kursk, the forces of the Central and Voronezh fronts slightly outnumbered the enemy in strength and materiel. To be more specific, we had a 40% superiority over the enemy in manpower, 90% in guns and mortars, 20% in tanks, and 40% in aircraft. But in relying mainly on tanks and motorized troops, the Nazi command deployed them in narrow sectors, creating considerable superiority over the Soviet troops which held the tactical defense zone in the early days of the battle. However, when our troops, which were disposed in operational depth, went into action, the superiority became that of the Soviet forces. In this case, the Nazi High Command overestimated the combat strength of its own troops and had greatly underestimated the possibilities of the Soviet forces. This time, the enemy had particularly relied on his Tiger and Panther tanks and the Ferdinand assault guns, apparently believing that these systems would stun the Soviet troops and they would not withstand their ramming impact. But this did not occur. In spite of the fact that Nazi Germany was still continuing to draw support from the economies of most of the European countries occupied by it, it could not maintain its own combat effectiveness in the face of the growing might of the Soviet Union. The war had begun to wear the enemy down, and the length of the conflict had already given the Soviet army an impressive military experience in large-scale operations. It was able to field combined arms formations of immense strength, which were especially efficient when they cooperated with ground forces and with air support provided by the Soviet Air Force. The sharp increase in the effectiveness of Soviet aviation and its impact on the enemy's operations during the Kursk fighting were also highly noticeable. This was the fruit of a great deal of hard work by our air forces, who undertook their task of air defense very seriously, skillfully, and decisively, and successfully fought off the enemy's aerial operations. While the Nazis sent many of their airplanes to support their troops, the Soviet Air Force was fighting efficiently and were able to deliver devastating blows to the enemy airfields. The successful combat action of the Soviet troops during the operations carried out in the Kursk Bulge was a key factor in guaranteeing the completion of the Kursk offensive. The most important thing to bear in mind was that the Soviet leadership had won a decisive victory in the battle fought near Kursk and Orel, thanks to the splendid operational work of our troops, the excellent preparation for the battle, and the correct estimates made of the enemy's combat strength and determination. Finally, this battle established the military might of the Soviet Union and its capability to deal the German army heavy blows, a feat that could not have been achieved without the good leadership of Stalin, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and Vatutin, and the cooperation of the Stavka and the front commanders. As regards the counter-offensive to be launched by the Steppe Front using all the forces on the Belgorod sector simultaneously, it should be recalled that when the armies of the Steppe Front were sent to reinforce the Voronezh Front, conditions were not yet ripe for putting all the forces of the Steppe Front into action. It only became quite obvious that circumstances were right for going over to the counter-offensive by July 20th, and the actual changeover to the counter-offensive could only be brought about after the comprehensive preparation of both fronts, which required a considerable period of time. On July 23rd, hot on the heels of the enemy, Soviet troops reached the line to the north of Belgorod, and, on the whole, seized the defence positions that had been held by the Voronezh Front until July 5th. Having discussed the situation with the Front Command, the General Staff, and the Supreme Commander, we resolved to halt the troops and thoroughly prepare them for an all-out counter-offensive. Before going over to the offensive, the fronts needed to do the following: regroup their forces and materiel, make thorough reconnaissance of targets for air and artillery attack, reinforce the troops who had sustained losses. This particularly applied to the 6th and 7th Guards armies, the 1st Tank Army, and a number of artillery units. Stock up with fuel, ammunition, and everything needed for an offensive operation conducted in depth. Besides this, the Steppe Front still had to work out a detailed plan for the counter-offensive and its comprehensive provisioning. The general idea of launching a counter-offensive near Belgorod was as follows. The Voronezh Front was to deal its main blow with the forces of the 5th and 6th Guards armies, the 5th Guards Tank, and 1st Tank armies in the general direction of Valky and Novaya Vodolaga. The artillery density in the sector where the 5th and 6th Guards armies were to make a breakthrough was brought up to 230 guns and mortars per kilometre, while tank density was increased to 70 per kilometre. The divisions were assigned 3-kilometre-wide sectors to make their breakthrough. This mass concentration of breakthrough means was needed because, on the very first day of the counter-offensive, it was planned to bring 2 tank armies into the breach. To the right, the 40th and 38th Armies went over to the offensive in the general direction of Greveron and further on to Trostianets. General S.A. Krasovsky's 2nd Air Army provided air cover. The Steppe Front, commanded by Colonel General Konev and comprised of the 53rd, 69th and 7th Guards armies and the 1st Mechanized Corps, had as its immediate objective the taking of Belgorod and mounting an attack on Kharkov, cooperating with the main forces of the Voronezh front. Air support for the troops of the steppe front was to be provided by General S.K. Goryunov's Air Army. When preparing the operation for the troops of the steppe front, I became acquainted with the commander of the 53rd Army, General Managarov, with whom I had had little contact earlier. Managarov made a very good impression on me, although I had to work hard to help him plan the offensive for his army. But when the work was over and we sat down to supper together, he took up an accordion and played several cheering pieces beautifully. My tiredness disappeared immediately. I glanced at him and thought that the men particularly liked this type of commander and would follow him through fire and water. I thanked Managarov for his excellent performance on the accordion, something which I had, incidentally, always wanted to do myself, and expressed the hope that he would give just as good a performance of artillery music for the enemy on August 3rd. Managarov grinned and said, "We'll try. We do have something to play on." I also liked the commander of the artillery, Lieutenant General N.S. Fomin, who possessed an excellent knowledge of methods of using large masses of ordnance in artillery offensives. He and Colonel General of the Artillery Chistyakov, who was the Stavka representative, made a very good and helpful job of distributing the artillery, supplying it with ammunition, training the men, and getting everything ready for an effective artillery assault. The counteroffensive in the Belgorod area began on the morning of August 3rd. The artillery and aviation of the Voronezh front dealt a powerful blow, as a result of which the troops of the 5th and 6th Guards armies, which had gone over to the offensive and had been reinforced with a large number of tanks, soon broke through the main line of the enemy's defences. In the afternoon, the 1st and 5th Guards tank armies took advantage of the breach to move their vanguards forward 30 to 35 kilometres by the end of the day, completely destroying the whole of the tactical defence line in this sector. The steppe front did not have such powerful means as the Voronezh front to make a breakthrough, and the offensive went ahead somewhat more slowly here. By nightfall, the vanguards had advanced up to 15 kilometres, but even that was considered a great achievement, all the more so since the armies of the steppe front had stronger and deeper enemy defences to overcome. The next day, the enemy put up greater resistance, and the steppe front's offensive on August 4th progressed considerably more slowly. However, we were not troubled by this too much, as the shock group of the Voronezh front had been able to push ahead, gaining the flank of the enemy's Belgorod grouping. Here, fearing that they might be surrounded, the Nazi command began to withdraw their troops by the end of the day on August 4th, which allowed the troops of the steppe front to move ahead more quickly. At 6 o'clock on the morning of August 5th, the 270th Guards Rifle Regiment of the 89th Guards Rifle Division and units of the 305th and 375th Rifle Divisions were the first to break into Belgorod. The 93rd, 94th Guards and the 111th Rifle Divisions fought well. The 89th Guards and the 305th Rifle Divisions had the honorary name of Belgorod Divisions conferred upon them. Once they had cleared the remaining enemy troops out of the city, the armies of the steppe front, in coordination with the forces of the Voronezh front, rapidly forged ahead. In the evening of August 5th, in Moscow, the capital of our motherland, a salute resounded in honour of the valiant troops of the Bryansk, Western and Central fronts who had taken Orel, and the troops of the steppe and Voronezh fronts who had taken Belgorod. This was the first artillery salute during the Great Patriotic War fired to honour the martial prowess of the Soviet forces. Morale among the troops sharply improved. Faces were aglow with joy, courage and confidence in our forces. Having appraised the course of events on August 6th, the commanding officers of the steppe front and I sent proposals to the Supreme Commander regarding the further development of the operation on the Belgorod-Kharkov sector. From the Army in the Field, August 6, 1943. To Comrade Ivanov. We report, in view of the successful breach of the enemy front and the progress of the offensive on the Belgorod-Kharkov sector, the operation will further be conducted according to the following plan. 1. The 53rd Army with the Solomatin Corps will advance along the Belgorod-Kharkov highway, striking the main blow in the direction of Dergachi. The army should reach the Olshany-Dergachi line and replace Zhadov's units there. 2. The 69th Army is to advance to the left of the 53rd Army in the direction of Cheremoshnoye. When it reaches Cheremoshnoye, the army, after placing several of its best divisions under Managarov, is itself to remain in the front's reserve, to be brought up to full complement in the Mikoyan-Ovka-Cheremosh-Noye-Gryaznoye area. The 69th Army needs to be replenished with 20,000 men as soon as possible. The 7th Guards Army will presently advance from the Pushkarnoye area to Brodok and then to Boshkovka, dislodging the enemy front from north to south. From the Cheremoshnoye and Ziborovka line, the 7th Guards Army will strike the main blow at Tsiokuni and come out on the Cherkaskoye-Lozovoye-Tsiokuni-Kliuchkin line. It will advance on Murom with part of its forces from the Ziborovka area, and then on Ternovaya to help the 57th Army force the river Seversky Donets near Rubezhnoye and Stary Saltov. 2. It would be advisable for the 57th Army of the Southwestern Front to be handed over to and made subordinate to the Steppe Front, and preparations should now begin for the 57th Army's thrust from the Rubezhnoye-Stary Saltov line in a general direction towards Nepokritaya, and then onto the Frunze State Farm. The 57th Army must be brought out to the Kutuzovka State Farm, Frunze State Farm, Rogan, northern line. Should the 57th Army remain subordinated to the Southwestern Front, the moment Shumilov approaches the Murom sector, it must be ordered to conduct an offensive in the above-mentioned direction. 3. To perform the second stage, that is the Kharkov operation, the 5th Guards Tank Army, which is to come out at the Olshany-Stary-Merchik-Ogultsi line, must be placed under the steppe front. We suggest that the Kharkov operation should tentatively be arranged according to the following plan. A. The 53rd Army, in coordination with Rotmistrov's army, is to envelop Kharkov from the south and southwest. B. Shumilov's army is to advance from the north southwards from the Tsikuni-Dagachi line. C. The 57th Army is to advance from the east from the Frunze State Farm and Rogan line, enveloping Kharkov from the south. D. If the 69th Army has been replenished by this time, it is to fan out at the junction between Zhadov's and Managarov's armies in the Olshany area and is to advance southwards to provide support for the Kharkov operation from the south. The 69th Army is to come out on the Snezhkov-Kut-Minkovka-Prosyanoye-Novoselovka line. E. The left flank of the Voronezh front must be brought to the Otrada-Kolomak-Snezhkov-Kut line. Shadow's army and the left flank of the 27th Army are charged with this mission. It would be advisable to have Katukov's 11th Army in the Konyagi-Alexeyevka-Marefa area. The southwestern front must strike a blow from the Zamostia area in the general direction of Merefa, moving forwards along both banks of the river Mnja. Part of its forces are to advance to Osnova via Chuguyev. Part of its forces must clear the forests of the enemy to the south of Zamostie and emerge at the Novoselovka-Okochaya-Verkhny-Bishkin-Gayevka line. 4. To conduct the Kharkov operation, besides the 20,000 extra men, we need another 15,000 men for the divisions of the 53rd and 7th Guards Armies, 200 T-34 and 100 T-70 tanks, besides 35 KV tanks to bring the tank unit's front line up to full complement. 4 self-propelled artillery regiments and 2 engineer brigades need to be moved up. The air forces on the front should be brought up to full complement with assault and combat aircraft and bombers in the following numbers: 90 fighters, 40 PE-2 and 60 IL-2 planes. Please endorse. Zhukov, Konev, Zakharov. Meanwhile, the action was still ongoing. On August 7th, the 1st Tank Army and the advanced units of the 6th Guards Army of the Voronezh Front seized the town of Bogodukov. The enemy no longer had a single solid front. His 4th Army was operating in considerable isolation from the Kampf group, and he had no forces to close the gap. The group of enemy forces withdrawing westwards from Grevoron, comprised of 3 infantry divisions and the 19th Tank Division, was attacked by a big group of aircraft from the 2nd Air Army and then destroyed by General Trofimenko's 27th Army, which complicated the situation of the enemy's 4th Army even more. On August 11th, the units of the 1st Tank Army crossed the Kharkov-Poltava railway line. To save the 4th Army from inevitable disaster, German Army Group South hastily moved its last reserves to the Aktyrka area. Fearing that his Kharkov grouping would be surrounded, the enemy rallied his troops comprising 3 tank divisions, Totenkopf, Viking and Reich, and on August 11th struck a counterblow at the 1st Tank Army and the units of the 6th Guards Army. The debilitated units of the 1st Tank Army and the 6th Guards Army, unable to withstand the blow, began to retreat to more advantageous lines. At that time, General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was rushed to their help. Fierce fighting ensued and lasted for several days. By nightfall on August 16th, the enemy had been halted by joint efforts. The enemy dealt a counterblow from the Aktyrka area on August 18th. To destroy him, the 4th Guards Army from the Supreme Command Reserves was sent into action in addition. It was commanded by General G.I. Kulik. Unfortunately, he coped badly with his duties and soon had to be removed from command. The armies of the steppe front moved right up to Kharkov, engaging in combat in its environs. Managorov's 53rd Army was energetic in action, particularly its 89th Guards Rifle Division, commanded by Colonel M.P. Seryugin, and the 305th Rifle Division under the command of Colonel A.F. Vasilyev. In action day and night, the units of the 53rd Army tried to make the breakthrough in the defences on the approaches to the city more quickly. The fiercest battle was fought for height 201.7 in the Polovoy area, which was taken by a combined company of 16 men from the 299th Rifle Division, commanded by Senior Lieutenant V.P. Petrishchev. When only 7 of the men still remained alive, the commander addressed his men with the words, "Comrades, let us stand our ground on this height just as the Panfilov Division stood at Dubosekovo. We may die, but we shall not retreat." Nor did they retreat. The heroic fighters held the height until the units of the division reached it. For their valour and heroism, by decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, Senior Lieutenant V.P. Petrishchev, Junior Lieutenant V.V. Zhenchenko, Senior Sergeant G.P. Polikhanov, and Sergeant V.E. Broisov had the title of Hero of the Soviet Union conferred upon them. The rest of the men were decorated with orders. The formations of the 20th Guards Rifle Corps, commanded by General N.I. Biryukov, troops commanded by General M.G. Mikaladze, Guards Lieutenant Colonel O.S. Gudomenko, and Colonel O.S. Dobrov, and also the 4th Guards Tank Corps particularly distinguished themselves in the fierce fighting. By August 22nd, the Soviet troops' offensive near Kharkov had increasingly been stepped up. To prevent his forces from being surrounded, on August 22nd, the enemy began to withdraw from Kharkov. The next morning, his last rearguard units pulled out, and the troops of the steppe front went into the city, where they were enthusiastically welcomed by the inhabitants. A big rally took place in Kharkov, which was attended by representatives of party and Soviet organizations of Ukraine and of the Red Army. The rally was held amidst great jubilation. The working people of Kharkov rejoiced. In Moscow, a salute was fired in honor of the valiant warriors who had liberated this big Ukrainian city. At that time, the troops of the steppe front were fighting to the south of Kharkov, advancing in the Marefa sector. Having thrust back the enemy's counter-attacking groupings around Bogodukov and Aktyrka, on August 25th, the Voronezh front had dug itself firmly in along the Sumy-Gadyach-Aktyrka-Konstantinovka line and was now preparing offensive operations to get to the middle reaches of the Dnieper. The steppe front was given a similar mission. On the Orel sector, the aim of the counter-offensive plan was to defeat the German 9th and 2nd Panzer armies, and to promote a thrust in the general direction of Bryansk. The troops on the left flank of the Western Front were charged with carrying out the decisive task of encircling and destroying the enemy group in the Orel area. By this time, the Soviets had established superiority in personnel, tanks, and artillery. On the morning of August 26th, troops of the Western Front delivered a powerful blow against the flanks of the German forces. The right flank of the Western Front and the left flank of the steppe front struck the German Army Group Centre at the beginning of the second stage of operations and made contact with the forces of the Voronezh front. On August 27th, the troops of the Western Front entered Orel. All of this was attended by a triumphant spirit in light of the rapid advance of the Red Army troops in the summer of 1943. The spectre of inevitable disaster now arose before Nazi Germany. The defeat of the German troops in the summer of 1943 had forced the Nazis to move 14 divisions and other reinforcements to the Soviet-German front from other fronts, thereby draining the strength of its forces in Europe. Hitler's attempt to wrest the strategic initiative from the Soviet command ended in failure. This proved how exhausted Germany was. Nothing could save her now. It was just a question of time. The Soviet Strategic and Tactical Command had become considerably more qualified and skilled in the art of warfare. Unlike the counteroffensive near Moscow and Stalingrad, the counteroffensive in the Kursk Bulge area was a premeditated and well-backed deep thrusting operation. Considerably larger forces than in the previous big counteroffensive operations were involved here. For example, 17 small field armies without tank formations were in the field near Moscow, and 14 field armies, 1 tank army, and several mechanized corps around Stalingrad. 22 powerful field armies, 5 tank and 6 air armies, and the biggest long-range air armies were involved in the counteroffensive near Kursk. In the course of the counteroffensive in the battle near Kursk, tank and mechanized formations were widely used for the first time. In a number of cases, these were a decisive factor in operational maneuvering, allowing for swift thrusts in depth and striking at enemy groupings in the rear. The tank armies, artillery divisions and corps, and the front's powerful air armies substantially enhanced our potential, and consequently changed the nature of the operations on the fronts, both in their scale and aims. The Soviet troops were now much more mobile than they were during the early period of the war, greatly increasing their maneuverability and daily rate of advance. The density of artillery and mortar fire and of tanks had been radically boosted. In the offensive campaigns in the summer of 1943, we were able to create a density of between 150 and 200 guns, and between 15 and 20 tanks per kilometre of front line. The victory of the Soviet forces near Belgorod, Orel, and Kharkov was, in many ways, facilitated by the partisans who were active in the enemy's rear. Especially the partisans of Byelorussia, the Smolensk and Orel regions, and the area along the Dnieper derailed many enemy trains. One of the decisive factors contributing to the victory in the Kursk Bulge was the high morale and level of political awareness of the Soviet troops. The commanders, political workers, party and Komsomol organizations worked intensively and painstakingly, both during the preparations for the battle and during the battle itself. They put a great deal of effort into raising the fighting capacity of the troops. On August 25, 1943, I was summoned to the General Headquarters to discuss the situation and the further tasks to be tackled in the overall offensive of the Soviet troops, which was now snowballing after the rout of the German troops in the Kursk Bulge area. Before my return to Moscow in August 1943, during the counteroffensive on the Voronezh and Steppe fronts, we were twice visited by Antonov, Deputy Chief of General Staff, who flew in to report on the revisions made by Stalin to the plan for the completion of the 1943 offensive operations and the General Staff's blueprints for the autumn campaign. Antonov was a peerlessly able general and a man of great culture and charm. It always delighted me to hear him present the strategic and tactical ideas of the General Staff. He set forth and explained the capacities of the German forces after their rout at the Kursk salient with the utmost clarity and conviction. The General Staff felt that the Nazi High Command still had considerable forces to carry on the war against the Soviet Union, especially since Britain and the United States seemed hardly inclined to launch any large-scale offensive in Europe. The landing of their troops in southern Italy, Sicily, made no substantial changes in the deployment of German forces on the various strategic directions, although the Nazi leadership was, of course, forced to face additional pressure. The General Staff felt, with the concurrence of the Supreme Commander, that on the Eastern Front Germany was no longer in a position to conduct large-scale offensive action. However, it did have sufficient manpower and material supplies for active defensive operations. This was amply illustrated by the fighting in the areas of Bogodukov, Akhtirka and Poltava, where the German forces battled fiercely and dealt us some rather telling counterblows, sometimes with temporary success. I fully agreed with Antonov's conclusions, and also believed that the Nazi High Command would exhort its forces to put up a stiff defence so that it could hold on to the Donbass and the area of Ukraine east of the Dnieper. The draft directives drawn up by the General Staff, and in part already issued to the fronts, called for a wholesale offensive on all fronts of the western and southwestern directions, with a view to reaching the eastern areas of Byelorussia and the river Dnieper to capture bridgeheads and thus help liberate the area of Ukraine west of the Dnieper. From Antonov's report, I gathered that Stalin was urging for the immediate development of the offensive so as to give the enemy no chance to organize a defense on the approaches to the Dnieper. I personally agreed with this general plan, though I disagreed with the form our offensive operations were to take, according to which our fronts from Velikiya Luki to the Black Sea were supposed to mount frontal blows. After all, I felt there were opportunities, after certain regroupments, to execute operations to cut off and encircle sizable enemy forces, thus facilitating further military successes. What I specifically had in mind was the southern enemy group in the Donbass, which could be cut off by a powerful blow from the Kharkov-Izium area in the general sector of Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye. Antonov told me that he himself shared my view, but the Supreme Commander was demanding that the enemy be pushed back immediately by means of frontal blows. Before Antonov flew back to Moscow, I again asked him to report my observations to the Supreme Commander and to communicate a request from the fronts for the replenishment of our tank units with material and trained effectives, since the bitter fighting had severely undermanned them. Several days later, Stalin phoned to say he had ordered tanks and replacements to be sent to Vatutin and Konev. Then he remarked that he did not share my view on the expediency of striking at Zaporozhye by means of the southwestern front troops from the Izium area because it would take too long. I did not bother to argue, since I knew that so far Stalin was generally disinclined for several reasons to contemplate any large-scale encirclement operations. In conclusion, Stalin demanded steps to ensure the rapid advance of our forces to the Dnieper. So, as I have already mentioned, on August 25th, Antonov and I arrived at the General Headquarters. Stalin had just ended a conference with the members of the State Committee for Defense, which had heard a report on the plan for the production of aircraft and tanks in the second half of 1943. Thanks to the tremendous efforts by the party and the people, our economy, and especially the war industry, were by that time already capable of supplying the fronts with all that was necessary. The accelerated development of the Second Baku, the heroic labour of the workers at the Kuznetsk and Magnitogorsk metallurgical combines, the construction of blast furnaces, power stations, and mines in the liberated areas ahead of time, the rising production at the non-ferrous metal and iron and steel plants in the Urals, Siberia, and Kazakhstan, the introduction of the conveyor method at the plants manufacturing military supplies, and the tremendous creative work on modernizing our military equipment and production technology, all gave us new possibilities for crushing the enemy. In 1943, our industry produced 35,000 high-class warplanes, 24,000 tanks, and self-propelled artillery pieces. In this respect, we were already far ahead of Germany, both in quality and quantity. The Nazi High Command issued a special order to avoid meeting engagements with our heavy tanks. After several questions about the situation on the Voronezh and Steppe fronts, the Supreme Commander asked whether we had received the directive on continuing the advance towards the Dnieper and inquired how the fronts were assessing their capabilities. I reported that the troops of the fronts had sustained considerable losses and should be replenished with sizable replacements in manpower and material, especially tanks. "All right," Stalin said. "We'll talk about that later. Right now let's listen to what Antonov has to say about the offensive in other directions." Antonov spread out his maps illustrating the situation in the western and southwestern strategic directions. As always, the maps had been most artistically prepared by the Operations Division of the General Staff. I have to admit that a graphically well-finished map is a great help in visualizing the general situation and elaborating the necessary decisions. Antonov also presented a report on the enemy forces. It was clear from what he said that the enemy was doing all he could to check the initiated offensive on the Kalinin, Western, Bryansk and Southwestern fronts. According to intelligence reports, the enemy had attempted to put up a defence on the following sector: the river Narva, Pskov, Vitebsk, Orsha, the rivers Sozh, Dnieper and Molokhnaya. Nazi propaganda was making the most of this defensive line, calling it the eastern wall against which the Red Army would break its head. On the progress of the so-called Smolensk offensive launched by the Western Front and the left wing of the Kalinin Front, Antonov pointed out that the troops had encountered formidable obstacles. First, there was the difficult wooded and marshy terrain, and second, there was the heightened resistance of the enemy troops, which were being reinforced with units moved up from the Bryansk area. Stalin asked, "What tasks are the partisan detachments carrying out?" "Their major tasks," Antonov replied, "are to frustrate railroad transportation in the Polotsk-Dvinsk, Mogilev-Zhlobin and Mogilev-Krychev sectors." "What is happening on the southwestern front?" "The forces of the southwestern front," answered Antonov, "having mounted an offensive in the front's centre, had no success. The situation is better on the front's left wing, where the Third Guards Army under General Lelyushenko is in contact with the enemy." I no longer remember every minute detail of that conference, but what I do recall very well is that Stalin demanded urgent measures to capture the Dnieper and the river Molokhnaya to prevent the enemy from completely devastating the Donbass and the area east of the Dnieper. His reasoning was quite correct, since in their savage fury the retreating Nazis were burning and destroying everything of value. They were blowing up factories and plants, reducing towns and villages to ruins, destroying power stations, blast and open hearth furnaces, razing schools and hospitals, and killing thousands of children, women, and old people. After giving Antonov his instructions, Stalin told me, as well as Ya, N. Fedorenko, and N.D. Yakovlev, to find out what could be done for the Voronezh and steppe fronts. Considering the important tasks that these two fronts were to execute, I reported to Stalin that evening on the number of men, tanks, artillery, and ammunition which should immediately be set aside for them. Stalin looked through the table of available supplies and my request for some time. Then, taking a blue pencil, as he usually did, he slashed my figures by almost 30 to 40%. "We'll give you the rest," he said, "when the fronts reach the Dnieper." The same day, I set off by plane for the combat zone, where the offensive was to continue according to the directive of the Supreme Command. Shortly thereafter, on September 6th, a new directive was issued by the Supreme Command. The fronts under my command were instructed to advance to the middle reaches of the Dnieper and capture a bridgehead there. The Voronezh front, under Vatutin, was to push forward towards Romny, Priluki, and Kiev, while the steppe front, under Konev, was tasked with advancing in the Poltava-Kremenchug sector. We faced challenges in making thorough preparations for the advance towards the Dnieper. The troops of both fronts were exhausted after continuous fighting, and issues with material and technical supplies were becoming increasingly evident. Nevertheless, from the marshals down to the last soldier, we all shared a burning desire to drive the enemy from our land as swiftly as possible and liberate the long-suffering Ukrainian people from the oppressive yoke of the invaders who sought revenge on the Soviet populace for their military setbacks, showing no mercy to either children or the elderly. We quickly formulated our operational and tactical decisions, as the troops and staff had accumulated substantial experience in swiftly analysing the situation, making decisions, and issuing brief, precise orders. The commanders and front headquarters had become adept at organising and conducting operations, making collaboration straightforward. We seemed to understand each other with barely a word exchanged. During this time, I continued to maintain contact with Vasilevsky, who was coordinating the actions of the southwestern and southern fronts. We were fully aware of the formidable enemy forces opposing our fronts in those areas. Although our forces had a slight edge in manpower, this did not eliminate the significant challenges facing our offensive operations, particularly as we had almost no quantitative superiority in tanks and combat aircraft. The offensive launched by the fronts under my control progressed slowly. The enemy was offering stiff resistance, especially in the Poltava area. However, in the first half of September, after suffering heavy losses, they began withdrawing from the Donbass and Poltava regions. The 3rd Guards Tank Army under Rybalko, which had arrived from the Supreme Command Reserve and been deployed on the Voronezh front sector, began to aggressively pursue the enemy in the Dnieper sector. In addition to the 3rd Guards Tank Army, the Voronezh front was reinforced with the 13th and 60th Armies, commanded by Generals Pukov and Chernyakovsky, respectively, from October 5, 1943. Other fronts also underwent regroupings. The Steppe Front received the 52nd and 5th Guards Armies from the Voronezh Front under Generals Korotiv and Zhadov. The German troops, no longer strong enough to withstand our forces' onslaught, began to retreat toward the Dnieper. The fronts did everything possible to secure bridgeheads on the river and began forcing this major water obstacle in hot pursuit of the retreating enemy. To demoralize the enemy troops, we committed all available aircraft from the fronts. As we pursued the enemy, our formations established improvised mobile detachments to swiftly move to the rear sections of the roads to capture and hold positions that the enemy might wish to occupy for defense. To further boost troop morale during the difficult task of crossing large rivers, the Supreme Command issued an order on September 9, 1943, awarding commanding officers the Order of Suvorov for forcing major rivers like the Desna, and the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for crossing the Dnieper. Military councils, political organs, and commanders at all levels began an extensive campaign to emphasize the importance of quickly capturing the western banks of the Dnieper and Desna. Everyone we spoke to regarding the upcoming mission and its execution methods was fully aware of the significance of capturing the Dnieper and swiftly crossing it, particularly the importance of liberating Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. After capturing Poltava on September 23rd, the Steppe Front advanced towards the Dnieper with the lead units of its left flank. Mechanized units of the 3rd Guards Tank Army and elements of the 40th and 47th Armies established a bridgehead on the Dnieper in the Veliki Bukrin area. Their objective was to quickly expand this bridgehead to allow the main group of the Voronezh front to outflank and encircle enemy forces in Kiev from the south and southwest. In response to our bridgehead, the German High Command deployed a considerable force against us, composed of the 24th and 48th Panzer Corps and up to 5 infantry divisions, which launched counterattacks to hold our forces in check on the Bukrin bridgehead. In the Lyutetse area, north of Kiev, units of General N. Yerchibisov's army successfully crossed the Dnieper during their advance. The first to reach the far bank were soldiers from the 842nd Rifle Regiment of the 240th Division. An assault group led by Sergeant P.P. Nefedov displayed particularly outstanding valor. For his heroism in capturing and holding the bridgehead, Nefedov was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, along with others who received military honors. The troops that forced the Dnieper displayed remarkable tenacity and courage. Upon reaching the river, they pushed onward without waiting for pontoons or heavy bridge-building equipment, utilizing whatever was available: timber rafts, ferries, fishermen's rowboats, and motorboats. Everything that was at hand was put to use. Fierce fighting erupted on the opposite bank for control of the bridgeheads. Our troops, having no time to dig in, immediately engaged the enemy, who did everything in their power to push them back into the river. The Dnieper crossing culminated in fierce battles that led to major successes for the Steppe Front in the Dnepro-Vokamenka and Domotkan areas. Notably, units of General G.B. Safulin's 25th Guards Rifle Corps, by repelling repeated enemy attacks, ensured the successful crossing of the Dnieper by the 7th Guards Army. Concurrently, units of General M.N. Sharokin's 37th Army also successfully forced the Dnieper. The first elements of that army to cross the Dnieper southeast of Kremenchug were from Colonel in Moshliak's 62nd Guards Division. The success of the front's forces was bolstered by their aviation and long-range air units, which secured air superiority through coordinated strikes on enemy airfields, defences and reserves. By the end of September, after breaching the enemy defences, our troops had crossed the Dnieper over a 700-kilometre stretch from Loyev to Zaporozhye, seizing several crucial bridgeheads from which further offensives were planned toward the west. For their bravery, gallantry and combat skill during the Dnieper crossing, and for successfully storming enemy defences, over 2,500 generals, officers, NCOs and enlisted men were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Between October 12th and December 23rd, the troops of the Voronezh front carried out the Kiev strategic operation. Initially, it was planned to eliminate the Kiev grouping and recapture the city with a major strike from the Bukrin bridgehead. However, this plan had to be abandoned as the enemy concentrated their main forces at that location. Thus, this direction was designated for subsidiary action, while the main blow was redirected to the Lyutezya bridgehead, north of Kiev, where the Nazis had weakened their northern sector. The new plan for liberating Kiev and continuing the offensive towards Korostin-Zhytomyr-Fastov was submitted to the Supreme Commander. After being reviewed by the General Staff and coordinated with the Central Front, it was endorsed by the Supreme Command. On October 25th, the 3rd Guards Tank Army began regrouping from the Bukrin bridgehead, a movement of approximately 200 kilometres along the Dnieper, effectively manoeuvring along enemy lines. Fortunately, the weather was unsuitable for flying, resulting in minimal enemy air reconnaissance during this manoeuvre. The 7th Artillery Assault Corps also regrouped from the Veliki Bukrin area. All measures of camouflage and radio deception were implemented, and some movements to the Lyutezya bridgehead occurred at night. To divert enemy attention from the Bukrin bridgehead, the troops in that area engaged in vigorous actions, employing various ruses to mislead the enemy. The enemy failed to detect the regrouping of our tank army and artillery corps, leading them to believe that our main assault would originate from that sector. By November 1st, the 38th Army, under General K.S. Moskalenko, along with the 3rd Guards Tank Army, the 5th Guards Tank Corps, the 7th Artillery Assault Corps, and numerous artillery units, had amassed at the Lyutezya bridgehead. In total, around 2,000 guns and mortars, along with 500 Katyusha rocket mortars, were gathered for the operation. By the time the offensive began, our forces on the Kiev sector had achieved a significant superiority over the enemy. In the early morning of November 3rd, unexpectedly for the Nazi forces, the assault on Kiev commenced, supported by the 2nd Air Army. To keep the enemy occupied around the Bukrin bridgehead, the 27th and 40th Armies of the front had initiated an offensive on November 1st. The enemy misidentified this attack as our main offensive and responded by deploying additional forces, including the SS Reich Panzer Division from General Field Marshal Manstein's reserve. This was precisely what we had anticipated. However, on November 3rd and 4, the advance of the 38th Army towards Kiev proceeded slowly. To create a decisive impact on the operation, it was decided to commit the 3rd Guards Tank Army. By the morning of November 5th, it had successfully cut the Kiev-Zhytomyr road, creating favourable conditions for the troops advancing on Kiev. By the end of November 5th, General Moskalenko's 38th Army, with Major General A. Yepyshev, a member of the Military Council, had reached the outskirts of Kiev. At 4 a.m. on November 6th, they captured the city alongside General A.G. Kravchenko's Tank Corps. A cable was promptly sent to the Supreme Commander, stating, "I am immensely happy to report that the task set by you to liberate our beautiful city of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, has been accomplished by the troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front. The city of Kiev has been completely cleared of the Nazi invaders. The troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front are continuing to execute the tasks assigned to them. General of the Army Vatutin, commander of the front, and Major General K.V. Krainyakov, a member of the Military Council, played crucial roles in successfully completing this operation. The Military Council of the 38th Army conducted extensive and important work in planning and organizing the operation to liberate Kiev and rout the enemy grouping. The Czechoslovak Brigade, commanded by Colonel Ludvík Svoboda, also participated in the fighting for Kiev, with 139 officers and enlisted men from this heroic brigade receiving Soviet orders. The Soviet people will always remember with gratitude the contributions of Czechoslovak officers and soldiers in defeating the Nazi forces during the Great Patriotic War. At 9 a.m., members of the Front's Military Council and I arrived in Kiev. Its residents, who had been hiding from the brutal reprisals of the vicious enemy, were streaming toward the city. A crowd quickly gathered around our vehicles. The first thing that struck me was how thin the majority of the people looked, yet their eyes shone with joy as they were seeing their liberators, their brothers, the Soviet soldiers, not just in their dreams, but in reality. They were overcome with joy and could not contain their tears. Everyone wanted to voice his innermost thoughts and feelings. As I drove along the Kreschatyk, once a beautiful avenue that I had known so well, I could recognize nothing. Everything was in ruins. This was what our ancient city of Kiev looked like when the fascists left it. After liberating Kiev, the front's troops drove the enemy even further west and gained control of Fastov, Zhytomyr, and several other towns. Fearing total disaster, the German High Command hastily concentrated a counter-assault force in the Zhytomyr area, comprising 15 divisions, including 8 panzer and motorized, with which it struck a powerful blow at the troops of the First Ukrainian Front on November 13th. As a result, the enemy was able to recapture Zhytomyr and press 30 to 40 kilometers forward. But the situation was soon remedied with the arrival of our reserves. Our frontline defences now passed 150 kilometers west and 50 kilometers south of Kiev. Let us now take a retrospective look to reconstruct the situation during this period in the sector of the Second Ukrainian Front, formerly the Steppe Front, which I was only able to visit sporadically since the combat situation required that I be present in the Kiev sector. On September 30th, the troops of the Second Ukrainian Front forced the Dnieper and seized a bridgehead on the western bank with a frontage of 30 kilometers and a depth of 15 kilometers. A bridgehead of this size was fully adequate for further continuing the thrust by the main task force.